On the early Wednesday morning of October 5th, 1898, a handful of pillager Ojibwe warriors held off approximately 100 United States soldiers on the shores of Sugar Point. Around 11:30 a.m., the Ojibwe began firing upon the soldiers from the surrounding woods. The soldiers, many of them young recruits, dropped to the ground, although their officers managed to get them to form a skirmish line around the cabin. This event is rumored to be the last Native American uprising on United States soil. This is the Battle of Sugar Point. Two main issues led to this confrontation. The first one is the harvesting of dead and downed timber by local logging companies. Logging companies had the right to work on the Leech Lake Reservation. They paid the Ojibwe for the timber they harvested, but the value was often underestimated, and payments were frequently late. Money received for timber, which was intended to sustain Ojibwe people, was mishandled, misappropriated, and frequently spent senselessly by Indian agents, which were white then, on behalf of the Ojibwe. Some loggers were allegedly seen setting fire to healthy trees in order to damage them and pass them off as dead. The second issue was the mistreatment and injustices at the hands of U.S. Marshals and other agents. Each time a witness or defendant was brought before the court in the town of Duluth, men were paid by the U.S. government. The Ojibwe were routinely rounded up and brought to Duluth on false charges to prevent future mistreatment and the destruction of nature on their land. The pillager Chippewa Band wrote a petition to U.S. President William McKinley. They stated, "We, the undersigned chiefs and headmen of the pillager band of Chippewa Indians of Minnesota, respectfully represent that our people are carrying a heavy burden, and in order that they may not be crushed by it, we humbly petition you to send a commission to investigate the existing troubles here. The Chippewa Indians of Minnesota have always been loyal to the United States and friendly to the whites, and they desire this friendship to be perpetual. We now have only the pine lands of our reservations for our future subsistence and support, but the manner in which we are being defrauded out of these has alarmed us. We trust that you will protect us when the truth reaches you." The letter went unacknowledged. Bigonagasheg was an elder Ojibwe man. He was a part of the protesting natives. In April of 1898, Bigonagasheg was arrested by a U.S. Marshal on bootlegging charges and brought to Duluth for court. Once let go due to insufficient evidence, Bigonagasheg was left to make the 135-mile journey home on his own. He hitched rides on multiple trains, only making it so far in the journey before being repeatedly thrown off for not having a ticket, leading him to eventually walk the last 40 miles home, wearing his moccasins down to his bare feet. It was at that moment he swore he would never allow himself to be arrested ever again. However, when he and Shebund Shekong, another Ojibwe man, traveled to the nearby native village of Onigum on September 15th, they were seized by the U.S. Deputy Marshal and the U.S. Indian agent as witnesses to a bootlegging operation and were going to be transported to Duluth. Sensing danger and not wanting to end up in Duluth again, Bigonagasheg called out for help. Local Ojibwe people in Onigum, hearing the plea of one of their elders, managed to free the two men. Bigonagasheg and Shabunda Shekong escaped across Leech Lake to Sugar Point. A small force of 20 soldiers under Lieutenant Chauncey B. Humphreys was dispatched to Onigum, where negotiations with Ojibwe representatives were held. After negotiations broke down, U.S. scouts traveled to Bear Island, just across Sugar Point. They reported that Bigonagasheg and his followers were refusing to surrender, so Humphreys decided to send for additional reinforcements. 77 soldiers under Brevet Major Melville Wilkinson, accompanied by General John Bacon, were sent from Fort Snelling to Walker. Others who took part in the expedition included U.S. Marshals and Deputy Marshals, Indian police officers, and several reporters. On the morning of October 5th, they boarded two small steamships in a barge. They sailed from Walker across Leech Lake until they reached Sugar Point, where Bigonegashik's cabin was located. After landing, two pillagers who were involved in the escape were identified and arrested. Bigonegashik and Shabunda Shekong could not be found. Apparently having fled prior to their arrival, the army searched the nearby woods for the Ojibwe who helped with the escape. After they couldn't find anyone, they set up camp. In the meantime, around 20 Ojibwe warriors took positions in the woods around the cabin. How the battle began has often been disputed throughout the years. The pillagers have held that the soldiers began firing on a canoe with two women and a child inside. The army claims that a soldier accidentally discharged his rifle. Regardless, at around 13:30 a.m., an intense firefight between the two sides began. The Ojibwe opened fire from the woods, surprising the soldiers. The soldiers managed to form skirmish lines, but suffered a number of casualties, including Major Wilkinson himself, who was wounded. The army pulled the wounded behind the cabin, which provided cover. Wilkinson soon returned to his troops, encouraging them, but was shot in the abdomen. He died an hour later in the cabin. The battle continued into the evening and night. Gunfire from the Ojibwe became less frequent, but some would take occasional shots throughout the rest of the day and night. That night, Indian officer George Russell was allegedly shot by mistake by a soldier who mistook him for a native. The next morning, the army retreated from Sugar Point back to Walker. In the fight, the Ojibwe didn't suffer any casualties, while the U.S. suffered 7 killed and 19 wounded. The initial report of the fight sparked panic and fear. Newspapers spread false claims of 100 soldiers killed, a massacre, and a native uprising. Some settlers expected attacks on nearby white settlements. Following that, 200 additional troops, carrying a Gatling gun, were sent from Fort Snelling to Walker. The Minnesota National Guard mobilized, while local settlers organized into militias. In Bemidji, residents barricaded themselves until a militia sent from Duluth arrived. In the meantime, the Ojibwe rapidly dispersed from their villages to remote parts of the reservation. With all of the nation's attention turned towards Leech Lake, the U.S. government was forced to hear the grievances put forth by the Ojibwe people. Commissioner of Indian Affairs William A. Jones was soon dispatched to the area. After an extensive number of meetings with tribal elders, an agreement was reached. Several pillagers turned themselves in for warrants related to escape. None of the warriors who participated in the fight were arrested. Bigonegashik upheld his pledge to never return to a U.S. court or jail. Shabunda Shekong wasn't arrested neither. Most of those who turned themselves in served between 2 to 6 months, and everyone involved received a full pardon from President McKinley a short time after. After the council concluded, Commissioner Jones criticized local and state officials for, quote, the frequent arrests of Indians on trivial causes, often for no cause at all, taking them down to Duluth and Minneapolis for trial, 200 miles away from their agency, and then turning them adrift without means to return home. When he returned to Washington, Jones later said, the Indians were prompted to their outbreak by the wrongs committed against them and chafed under unfair treatment. They now will go back to their homes and live peaceably if the whites will treat them fairly, which is very likely, as the whites were thoroughly impressed with the stand taken by the Indians. In this respect, the outbreak has taught them a lesson. After that, the situation calmed down, and reforms in the management of timber on the Leech Lake Reservation eventually led to the establishment of the Chippewa National Forest. Bigonegashik went on to live another 18 years in the area before passing peacefully. The U.S. Army never returned to the shores of Sugar Point on Leech Lake.